I'm just gonna say what we're all thinking. This pandemic's great. Where can I get another one?
I'll tell you where. It's in this box. Pandemic is a classic 2008 board game where up to 4 players fly around the world, cooperatively working to stop the spread of diseases as a nice team. And it has 3 great expansions if you instead want to start diseases, or be in a lab, or make sure that animals also have a bad time. You know those sweet parallels between coronavirus and the Spanish flu? Guess what? There's a pandemic guest starring the Spanish flu. Quins, I've got nothing against diseases. Who I hate is the sea. I've heard it 1,000 times. There's a pandemic for that. But what if humans are the real disease? You've been to university and I love it. There's a pandemic for that. Are you anti-disease but pro-tentacle? There's a pandemic for that. Quins, can I be a pandemic? You crazy. Yeah, there's a pandemic for that. Quins, I don't want to play pandemic. I just want to roll dice. I hear you. There's a pandemic for that. No, not that kind of game. Just like a game where I don't have to think, where I can just roll dice and mentally check out. Right, gotcha. There is a pandemic for that. No, stop. This is silly. That is altogether too much pandemic, all right? What I want is less pandemic. Luckily, there's a pandemic for that. Maybe let's just stow the silliness for a second and be real. The last thing any of us would want in 2020 is more pandemic. And yet, here we are. Pandemic Legacy Season 0 is probably the best pandemic box ever made, making it the most entertaining game in perhaps the most entertaining series in board games. Although, just to pique your interest, I'll also say that it's not my favourite pandemic game. As always, there will be no spoilers in this review. My copy of this game is covered with spoilers, so we're presenting this review with a mint condition copy, so you don't need to worry about seeing anything you shouldn't. So, let's recap. Pandemic Legacy Season 1 was released in 2015 and represented the game of Pandemic reimagined by Willy Wonka. This box offered a campaign of pandemic games that could be played through once and never again, with players changing the board with stickers, opening sealed compartments full of stuff, and making choices with consequences that rippled outwards into every future game in this story. Pandemic Legacy Season 1 was, and still is, superb. At the time, hobbyist board gamers called it the greatest game ever made. Then, in 2017, Season 2 came out. A post-apocalyptic continuation of the story with players working to reconnect a shattered world. Pandemic Legacy Season 2 was drastically more experimental and daring than Season 1. It also felt less inclined to use the original 2008 classic game of Pandemic as a foundation. The result was a game that was more divisive than Season 1. And now we have the conclusion of the trilogy. Pandemic Legacy Season 0 is a prequel set in 1962 where players don't work for the Center of Disease Control, but instead work for the CIA. And rather than racking up air miles trying to stem the flow of disease, you are instead flying around the world snuffing out Soviet agents who are appearing all over like strawberry jam smothered over global toast. In terms of mechanics, the big change in Season 0, as compared to normal Pandemic, is you no longer cash in sets of cards to cure diseases, because there is no known cure for communism. Instead, you're going to use a less high-tech solution. You're going to cash in cards with an affiliation of either Soviet, neutral, or allied to create a bunch of mean dudes in a van. And once your team has vans on the board, anyone can on their turn spend an action bossing any van around the globe, allowing it to hoover up Soviet agents like a spy-devouring Roomba. The more vans you have out, the easier a time you're going to have snuffing out Soviet spies, and the more time you'll have to focus on completing your objectives for that month. What objectives, you ask? Why, that would be telling. Let me make this nice and easy for you. If you have not played any of the Pandemic Legacy seasons before, I think you should play one of them, and I think it should be Season 0. Not because it's a prequel, but because while all of the Pandemic Legacy seasons are fun and fascinating and tense and surprising and funny, I think Season 0 is the designers at their most experienced and at their most expansive. Without wanting to spoil any of the literally hundreds of surprises sequestered in this treasure chest of a box, Season 0 has more components and cards and tons more writing than the other seasons. Season 1 shipped with a legacy deck of cards to guide you through the story. In Season 0, we are now up to 3 legacy decks. Also, the story in this game feels like it branches more based on decisions you make. The game has more world building, it has more colour. Season 0 is so slathered in secrets, they've even had to figure out more ways to hide. Okay, seems I can't say any more without setting that klaxon off. Frankly, I don't know why I agreed to have it installed. So to avoid spoilers today, I'm mostly going to be talking about Season 0 in terms of how it relates and how it compares to the other 2 seasons. If you would prefer more information on Pandemic Legacy in general, I'd suggest watching my reviews of those 2 games. So, for this review, let me talk briefly about the design ethos behind the different seasons. Season 1 simply asked how the designers might use legacy mechanics to add surprises and drama and permanence and consequences to the legendary cooperative board game of Pandemic, making it the least striking and novel season, but where the puzzle is the most consistently strong. In Season 2, the designers frisbeed the rulebook out of the window and worked out a sequel where your actions didn't just change the game, but were tools you would use to build the game yourself, painstakingly mapping out the world over months as if you were loading Google Maps on an internet connection from 1986. This was the most experimental season. What I think defines Season 0 is adventure. This is the first Pandemic Legacy without the threat that if you fail an objective, then put down a sticker because thousands of people are dead. It's a lot more easygoing than that. Failing an objective in Season 0 usually means just denying your group a juicy fragment of the game's plot. That's partially because this is a sequel and the world can't change too much because whatever happens in your story still has to set up Season 1, but it's also part of a design ethos that's generally more friendly. This is the first Pandemic Legacy that's not fixated on the chilling notion that your character could die saving the world. Season 0 returns to more comforting role-playing game territory in giving players dollop upon indulgent dollop of ways to customize their character. Every player in your group is going to be forever thickening their gorgeous little passport with stickers. And there is still tension in this game, let me clarify. If you spend too much time in cities under surveillance, then your identity will eventually become compromised. But there's all these little winks and nudges that say, you're probably not going to die. This feels like a passport to adventure. The other way to put it is, fun simply feels like it's at the forefront of the designers' minds more often, from Mr. Potato heading your player character, to slipping cards you have in these dinky little intelligence and personnel files, and even in this Saturday morning cartoon depiction of spy work. Pandemic Legacy Season 0 is the Cold War depicted without blood, without politics, and come to think of it, without war. Considering the designers of this had no idea that coronavirus was waiting to ambush Season 0 upon release, they were incredibly lucky that for this box, they've decided to abandon the traditionally brooding atmosphere that accompanies Pandemic. It feels like they're done with darkness, and this time they just want a box full of surprises that will make people smile after every mission, every objective, every decision, and sometimes even in between those moments. The designers simply know where to hide stuff now because they've made 2 boxes before. But not only that, they still have even more ways to hide stuff in Season 0 because they have to impress people who've played Season 1 and 2. And all of this is why I say that this is the best Pandemic Legacy, and I say this is the one you should play. But I'm not going to keep you hanging any longer. I've got to describe why this is not my favourite. For me personally, the high watermark of this series was playing Pandemic Legacy Season 1 and being enthralled. I got emotional talking to my fellow players about when to try and save cities and when to amputate them from our support network and leave those ill, imaginary people to die. Now, it could be the case that dark stories just excite me more as a player, but I'm thinking a lot at the minute about another Legacy game, The King's Dilemma, which is absolutely fantastic as well. We reviewed that earlier this year. Now, that game also had a bleak story, and I think it showed us that bleakness can make a game's legacy elements pop off the table by threatening you with truly grim consequences for your actions. Board games as an activity are intrinsically light, so it's only by having a dark story that you can truly create contrast. In the course of all of my 15 or 16 games of Pandemic Legacy Season 0, the height of my moral quandaries was wondering if I should just take the cat eye glasses for my character without asking any of the other players, because I really wanted them mine now. Thank you. Now let me stress here, I am saying the story in Season 1 is light. I am not saying it's bad, I'm not saying it's small. In fact, the story in Season 0 is so broad and expansive and sprawling, it makes the story of Pandemic Legacy Season 1 look like something someone wrote while waiting for a bus that just arrived. I guess what I'm getting at is that, unlike Pandemic Legacy Season 1 or The King's Dilemma, the story in Season 0 did excite me, but it never moved me. The other reason that I still say Season 1 is my favourite is that when everyone got hot and bothered about legacy games when Risk Legacy first came out in 2011, it wasn't just because of this idea that board games could have twists and surprises and unlockable content of the type that Season 0 disgorges constantly. It was also the idea that legacy games could offer consequences, permanent consequences. And Season 1 didn't have many legacy elements compared to Season 1, but when you put a sticker on the board, you felt you were stuck with it, pun not intended. Every sticker felt like you were scarring the board in a way that felt like the game had changed. On the other hand, Season 0 is so full of twists and turns and tweaks that the changes actually become less exciting because they'll probably change. Yes, on my turn, I screwed up. I let the Soviet spy escape, but who cares? In 2 months' time, we might be working for the Soviets. Not quite the same as in Season 1, where yes, I screwed up on my turn, and that means we cover up Paris with a sticker because it no longer exists. The final reason I say that Season 1 is my favourite is that it still had what was my favourite mechanic in Pandemic, which was if you would ever put a fourth disease cube in a city, it instead pops, and we place disease cubes in every connecting city instead. However, obviously, Soviet spies don't do that. They don't sort of reproduce like a kind of fractal Carmen Sandiego. Instead, if you would ever put a fourth spy in a town, you draw the bottom card of the infection deck, and it will tell you what incident happens. And these could be anything. Who knows what the Reds are up to? Except practically 60% of the time, the effect will refer to something that isn't on the board. So 60% of the time, nothing happens, which is underwhelming. And 40% of the time, you can get whomped by something that absolutely ruins you, demolishing your chances of winning the game. And I don't know why they do that. If the thrill of Pandemic is in planning and prediction, I do not know why they would introduce a system that you cannot plan for and you can't predict. Except, I guess I do. Pandemic Legacy Season 0 is an adventure. But candidly, I don't think you should listen to my criticisms, not just because it's personal taste, not just because this is an absolutely first-rate, phenomenal board game, but because when I talk about Season 1, I'm gazing into the past through rose-tinted, Coke bottle-thick prescription goggles. And while I remember all the things I liked about Season 1, I'm not going to remember all the stuff that hadn't been invented yet. Goodness gracious, we were impressed in 2015 when Season 1 told us to destroy a card. There's a bit in Season 0 where you're asked to destroy a... My friends and I didn't even know how to do that. There had to be a discussion. So, in conclusion, if you've not tried any of the Pandemic Legacy games, I would absolutely buy one, and I would absolutely make it Season 0 if you want a fun adventure, or Season 1 if you want more of a stern puzzle and an exploration of what made the original game of Pandemic great. Perhaps it's as simple as saying, have you played base Pandemic? If not, Season 0 is good. If you haven't even explored why Pandemic's good, Season 1 is, I think, maybe the game for you. Let's try ending this video with me sat on the table like an uncool but well-meaning teacher. So I actually want to close by giving a little shout out to anyone else like me who might have played Season 1 and or Season 2, is wondering whether to climb back onto this plague-ridden pony for another ride, whether to buy Season 0 as well. And let me tell you a story. So internally at Shut Up and Sit Down, we were having a discussion as to who should review this. And we settled on me reviewing it because I did the review of Season 1 and 2. I can be the site's Pandemic Legacy guy. And then Matt can review the new Gloomhaven Jaws of the Lion and become the site's Gloomhaven guy. And I was happy with that state of affairs. Obviously, it's a great game. I get to review it. But in about June, right, the halfway point of this game, I realized that I would rather be playing Gloomhaven Jaws of the Lion. Not because this is a better or worse game, but because we get so dazzled by all the little ways Pandemic is changed by Legacy.
that it's easy to forget that underneath the legacy, this is just Pandemic. And between all the Pandemic I played before, and then Pandemic Legacy Season 0, 1 and 2, and all the spin-offs, I've maybe played 70 games of Pandemic by now. And at some point, you got to ask yourself, when is that going to lose its luster? So, also, for the record, I had more fun playing The King's Dilemma earlier this year than I did playing this Legacy game. Not because one's better than the other, but because I've played some variation of Pandemic Legacy dozens and dozens of times now with all the different games in a campaign. So, all I'm saying, I guess, is just ask yourself whether you want more of this, because just because they keep making it doesn't mean you have to keep buying it. There's a ramen place right outside my window that I love more than any restaurant in Brighton. But if I ate there every time they made ramen, I would be at best unhappy and at worst dead. So there's something for you to chew on. And now I've encouraged you to be financially responsible. Please allow me to encourage you to be a little irresponsible.
Whew, I am sweating like a sausage. If you enjoyed this video, two things. First off, you are clearly a person of impeccable style and grace. But second, please consider paying as much as you think this video and all of our content is worth. Shut Up and Sit Down is currently in the middle of one of its twice yearly donation drives. We don't like to bang on a lot about how all the content we make is funded by donations. This Pandemic Legacy video took tens and tens of hours to make. It's all because of Shut Up and Sit Down's donors, who are just a lovely club of people who pay for this stuff because they want it to exist. So if you've not yet given us money, please consider doing so. You can watch this video to see us talk about donations, and that might be exciting, or you can skip all that jazz and go straight to this link to give us as much or as little as you can afford. Thank you very much.